Chapter 10, Part 1, Disaster. Elizabeth could tell that they were almost there, wherever there was. No one had ever mapped the Great Eye, but she was guessing she was getting closer to the center. That evening, just before dusk, the wind began to pick up. It might have been pleasant anywhere else. All the men in Zet's group had been looking forward to the cooling in the evening. Instead, the wind turned the oven-like temperature of the Great Eye into a furnace. The dust was even worse, though. All the fine grit was picked up by the wind and thrown at them. Usually, Mitha would walk beside the camel for a little while. Not for too long, though. Her captors didn't seem to approve of her exercising too much. Anyway, she had no desire to leave the camel tent. Even with all the flaps closed, the dust sifted in. Outside, above the scream of the wind, she could hear the camels calling to each other. She dared to peek outside. Her captors were busy holding the camel's reins, 2 or 3 men to a camel. She imagined they'd have to moisten rags and wipe out their noses to keep the camels breathing. Hopefully, they were choking in the dust as well. Her camel was made to sit down. She could feel the whump when it set. Zet peered in briefly to check on her. It was no warm look of concern he gave her and Jankar, she thought. It was more like the look a game hunter would give his prize tiger to be sure it was still there. "Don't go out tonight," he commanded. "Yes, sir," Mitha said. "Duh," Elizabeth thought. "I hope you choke in that dust." Even opening the tent flap a moment left a cloud of dust in the tent. Jankar started to choke and cry. Elizabeth took her water skin, wet a rag, and wiped his face and nose. It left little mud smears on his dark brown face. He chuckled to himself. He laughed more when she wiped the 3 goats' noses and mouths out. Mitha laughed too. This is what a good goatherd did. "Shut up," Elizabeth told her. She had been sitting up, singing and chanting to Jankar. At some point, she must have dozed off. She heard several shrieks and some camel cries. Elizabeth could tell it was later because the air had grown cold and it was dark. The wind was still shrieking. She pulled very dirty, gritty blankets over her and Jankar. The goats were already under the blankets. Hopefully she wouldn't have fleas in the morning. Elizabeth woke up when the sun shone on her face. The tent flap had popped open and she could see the blue sky. The desert was already starting to heat up. She checked her water skin. There was only a little bit left. Elizabeth took a tiny sip and saved the rest for Jankar and the goats. Jankar was still asleep, so she scrambled out onto the pebbles. The ground looked as if nothing had happened all night. Her hair felt gritty and her skin crackled. Elizabeth felt miserable and thirsty. She wondered if she should ask for some water from Zet. Then she realized the camels were gone. Of the 12 camels they had started with, 2 were left. Her camel and the other were the only ones in sight. The other camel was lying down but was crying in pain. About 30 yards away she could see a heap of supplies, and another 20 yards away another heap. She guessed 2 of the camels had somehow dropped their loads when they ran off. All the men were standing around arguing. Elizabeth just had to find out what was happening. She decided even Mitha would want to know. Elizabeth walked up to Zet, who was standing next to the camel in pain. "Excuse me, sir, when are we leaving?" she asked. "Do you see this, stupid girl?" he screamed. "We lost supplies and water. We could die. Get back to your camel. When we're ready, you can carry the baby and watch the goats. Your camel will have to carry water." He stalked off toward the angry men to break up a fight. One man was on the ground bleeding. Apparently, Zet's men didn't like their odds. Tough as they were scared. Mitha was terrified of her captors. Elizabeth laughed to herself. "I'm not going to walk," Elizabeth thought to herself. "There's no way I can carry Jankar in this heat." She had to do something fast. Elizabeth kneeled down by the camel that was keening with pain. The Great Eye was almost completely flat. You could probably walk 100 miles and never step in a hole. Somehow, this camel had found the only hole for miles around. The camel had broken its left back leg. Zet and the men were on the right-hand side of the camel in the distance. She glanced around the camel's butt, but no one was looking in her direction. Another man was down with a knife wound, she thought. Elizabeth put her right hand above the break and her left below it. The camel flinched. Elizabeth had never healed an animal before. She squeezed the leg. Magic flowed out of her. She could feel the leg heal. Oops, the camel could tell it was better. "Stay down," she muttered. She was almost all the way back to her tent on her camel before the healed camel roared, or whatever it was the camels did. Then it stood up. Elizabeth crawled into her tent as quickly as she could. Across the way, Zet turned to look at the camel as it stood up. While his men gestured in amazement and belief, he turned to see Mitha crawl back into her tent. Something was not right, but he didn't have time to figure it out just now. Elizabeth wanted to lie down. Healing that camel had taken a lot out of her, but of course Jankar was sitting up. He was getting started on his hungry cry. "Okay, Jankar, I'm coming," she told him. Elizabeth didn't look out again until she heard the handler urge the camel up. With a bump, they were up again. She could feel the camel lurch forward. She could see the men had left a huge pile of supplies strewn out on the desert floor. Most of the men were walking. They didn't appear very happy about it either. Elizabeth held Jenkar so he could see outside. He laughed. Maybe watching the kidnappers walk was amusing. For the next 3 days, she received less and less water. Elizabeth felt feverish because she gave most of her water to Jenkar. She had to use a dry rag to wipe the mud streaks off his face. It was a process he didn't enjoy. Feeling parched and sick, Elizabeth was greatly annoyed when the camel stumbled to a stop. She parted the curtain to look out. The sun was about to set. The view before her was so amazing she even let Jenkar take a look.